Chapter 8.
I'm so sorry,
Someone said amidst the darkness that enveloped Emily's world.
There's nothing more we can do for her.
She had no idea where that voice was coming from, or who it belonged to. She could no longer hear the sounds of explosions rocking the city, and the stabbing pain that had caused her to lose consciousness receded into a dull ache that caused extreme discomfort, but not the same agony as before. The world was darkness. A darkness beyond the darkness that there seemed to be no escape from. She could see nothing and no one, but the sounds of movement and conversation around her were evident. Emily had a hard time moving, as though she were trying to claw her way out of a deep hole with mounds of dirt shoveled atop her. What was this? Was this what death felt like? Was this hell? She could hear the sound of someone crying, a pleading voice cutting through her thoughts, asking the apologetic speaker she had first heard if there was truly no other way.
We've exhausted all paths.
The tone was apologetic, but not overly comforting. It was cold and clinical, and Emily recognized it from her studies. It was the kind of detached cadence that doctors and hospitals use to convey bad news. It was how they maintained distance from the death they witnessed every day. It was how doctors and nurses were able to compartmentalize their emotions and keep the heaviness of lost life and grieving families from weighing them down. Why was she hearing that now? It was then she noticed the cold hardness of the street underneath her back was completely gone. She was lying on some kind of material that could be felt under her hands and on the backs of her bare legs. It wasn't overly soft, certainly not a bed. It had some give to it, almost like a hammock. Emily's mind was still swimming, still hazy, and she felt lost in the dizzying nothingness of the moment. It would be so easy to just let go of those thoughts and drift. Every cell in her body seemed to be screaming at her that she should do just that. Just let go. And trust that everything would be fine. Stop addling her reeling brain with thoughts of where she was or what had happened. Just drift. And let the sweet waves of dizzying numbness comfort her in the dark. But then, she remembered her mission. She remembered she had a destination, a goal, a place she needed to be. Emily held on to the vision she had experienced right before blacking out, of her father arriving at their bunker, only to find it empty with no supplies disturbed. She couldn't allow that to happen. She needed to wake up, needed to get out of here. She needed to figure out exactly where she was. And, more importantly, how she could get out of there. Emily heard the sounds of sobbing now, of unfathomable levels of grief and loss. Beyond that, she could hear the moments of pain and clinical conversations about medications and first aid equipment. It sounded like a hospital, but that didn't seem possible. How could she have made it from the street to a medical facility? Who had brought her here? And how were they treating her in a building ravaged by the EMP attack? Still unable to will her eyes to open, Emily focused on her left hand. It took everything in her power to twist her fingers, eventually pulling them closer to her palm and forming a fist. She then let that fist go and allowed her fingers to uncurl before pulling them back in again. She did this several more times before trying something new. Emily now had enough strength to drag her left hand along the surface of the mattress, bringing it toward her body. As soon as the side of her hand made contact with her hip, Emily slid her palm up onto what felt like a paper medical gown. Fumbling for a moment, she managed to slip her hand beneath it, feeling the smoothness of her skin. She was completely naked under the gown and continued to work her hand up her body, past her hip bone and onto her stomach. She then pulled her arm back slowly to feel for the sharpened projectile that had pierced her side. She felt nothing, save for the bandages and gauze wrapped around her midsection. Her palm made contact with the soft surface of the adhesive dressing, and a fresh stab of pain worked its way through her body. She groaned involuntarily at the response, hearing the noise rise from her throat.
"Oh, look who's awake,"
someone called out from off to the right of where she lay. The voice was soft, light, and definitely a female.
"Looks like I owe the captain some rations."
Emily continued to fumble with the bandages underneath her gown, even as she could hear someone moving around her position. She could clearly make out the female speaker's steps sliding against the floor, until a pair of hands with the unmistakable feel of latex gloves covering them, softly but firmly, clamped down around her forearm. The hand was small, but it was still able to forcibly remove her hand from the bandages.
"There now,"
the same kind voice said, closer to her ear as it whispered.
"Let's not look a gift horse in the mouth and start messing around with these bandages now, all right?"
Who was speaking? Where was she? The questions were becoming louder within her hazy mind. Finding answers was starting to feel more and more like an urgent matter. Emily focused all her strength on her face, specifically her eyes. With another groan of pain and exertion, she bore down on every relaxed muscle in her face as she forced her eyes to open into slits. The room around her was dark, but there was sunlight filtering in from somewhere off to the side. She could see a patch of brightness spread along the blankets that covered her legs.
"Well, good morning,"
that kind female voice said again, clearly noticing the flutter of Emily's eyelids. She followed the sound of the voice to her left side, the blurry world solidifying as she focused her sight on the figure standing over her. At first, all she could see was the face. It was round, with an olive complexion and a nose that seemed to poke its way out of nothingness above a small mouth that was pulled into a gentle half-smile. The woman above her was Asian, with kind eyes framed by straight black hair and set behind a pair of round glasses. Feeling more of her strength return with each passing second, Emily pulled her lips open and dragged her tongue out to moisten them. When she tried to speak, she instantly started coughing, which rattled her injured torso and caused her to wince in pain.
"Whoa,"
the young woman said to her, looking no older than Emily. She laid a hand on Emily's shoulder, easily overpowering the injured young woman in her weakened state and preventing her from moving.
"Don't overexert yourself. You'll pop your stitches."
"Where?" Emily managed to croak out of her dry throat.
"Relax,"
the woman said, raising her eyebrows and giving Emily the kindest, warmest smile she had seen since the EMP had gone off.
"Don't worry. You're safe now. You're in the hospital. You were injured in the bombings. Do you remember the bombings?"
Emily gave a slight nod, her mind flashing back to that horrifying moment as the building beside her erupted into a fiery rain of death. She remembered, in that moment, the frenzied need to save an innocent child from a dark fate. She also realized that had she heeded her father's wisdom and minded her own business, she would have been long past that building by the time it had exploded. But of course, it meant that little girl would be dead.
"Well, good,"
the woman said.
"That gives me hope you didn't suffer any kind of brain injury."
She sounded relieved.
"Without an MRI machine, we had no way to be sure."
"Who are you?" Emily managed to ask. The woman gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze, caressing the front of it with a gentle thumb.
"My name's Sophia,"
she said, keeping her voice light. It was the kind of tone one might offer to a scared child or puppy found on the street.
"Sophia Chen is my full name, but everyone here calls me Medic."
That struck Emily as odd. Why would a medical professional call one of their own by such a name? She couldn't have been a doctor. Even a nurse would have introduced herself by her title. So, who was this kind woman with a gentle bedside manner?
"I've been taking care of you since we found you,"
she said.
"There were so many dead and dying people out there. I was honestly shocked when we found someone who might be able to pull through. At first, I assumed you were a goner. You had lost a lot of blood, and you had a foreign object sticking out of your gut. But the captain saw something in you, I guess. He thought we might be able to help, so we brought you here with the other survivors, and here you are.
The captain? Medic? And she had mentioned rations before. Emily's mind had cleared enough to connect the dots. This woman was military. She had been found by the military, the same military that was oddly absent on the street just before the city had been blown to hell. They had saved her, and apparently quite a few others. Emily was able to open her eyes wider now, her irises darting to the left and right, noticing a multitude of small rectangular cots spread throughout what looked to be an ICU. She turned her attention back to Sophia, and now saw that rather than wearing the scrubs or lab coat of a medical professional, she was wearing the fatigues of a military operative. How? Emily started to ask, before stopping to clear her throat. How long? She watched as Sophia's smile faded into a serious expression. She nodded in understanding.
5 days,
she said.
You've been here for 5 days, and honestly, you're one of the few who've managed to wake up. Like I said, you lost a lot of blood, but thankfully it was still early enough that we were able to get you a transfusion. By now, all the blood the hospital was storing is useless. I was able to stitch you up in the field, and then we brought you back here with the others. Though, most of them didn't make it.
Emily started to shake her head back and forth now, feeling her body come to life amid the soreness radiating through her torso. Turning her head to look around, she saw that the hospital was full of uniformed and armed soldiers patrolling the space with weapons drawn. Her stomach sank with horror. It had been 5 full days since the EMP attack. For 5 days, she had lain here in this cot while the city continued to fall. And for 5 days, these soldiers had likely been working to piece it back together. But what were military personnel doing patrolling the ICU of a hospital? Her eyes darted back to Sophia, to the kindness on her face. She hoped that, by some miracle, perhaps this was the face of government forces trying to fix everything. A face of kindness and compassion, of friendly empathy. Emily attempted to slip back into her bed when she felt something tighten around her ankle. Her eyes doubled in size as she looked down the length of her body, pulling the blankets up off her legs just enough to see metal handcuffs, with one link latched around her ankle and the other to the base of the plastic frame of her hospital bed. Her eyes darted back to Sophia, this time with a sense of panic rising in her throat. Sophia gave her a kind smile, looking down at the restraint and then back at Emily's face.
Just relax, she said. No one is trying to hurt you.
What the hell is this? Emily asked, gesturing emphatically with her left hand down toward her ankle.
It's just a precaution,
Sophia said.
There's still a lot we don't know. With communications down, no one knows what caused this disaster to happen. We don't know who's attacking us. So, until we're sure, we're taking every precaution possible while trying to help.
What do you mean by every precaution? Emily asked, a feeling of prickling dread causing a cold sweat to break out over her body. She already knew the answer to that question, but needed to hear Sophia say it.
Just for the time being,
the medic said patiently.
The government has declared a state of martial law over the city. The military is doing its best to try to help, to get us all through in one piece, but there's a lot of unrest out there. It's become pure lawlessness, and it's taking everything we have to stop the city from falling to complete anarchy.
Emily started to shake her head in disbelief. Everything her father had said, everything she had feared, it was all happening right before her eyes. And she was caught in the middle of it. Emily tried to pull her leg back, straining against the cuff. No, Emily said, panic rising in her voice. No, this isn't right. I have to go. I have to get home. She was glad she still had the mental wherewithal to say home and not accidentally blurt out the existence of her supply bunker. Sophia gave her another calm smile and looked as though she wanted to reach out and offer another touch of the shoulder to help calm her down. But she wisely decided against that, given Emily's agitated state. The pain in her torso was still great. Even if she had been free of the cuffs, she never would have been able to get out of the bed on her own power. But still, the adrenaline flowing through her was waking up her body. With every beat of her frenzied heart, she was starting to feel stronger.
Unfortunately, no one is able to go home until we have a handle on this,
Sophia said, sounding legitimately apologetic.
The military is setting up stations all over the city to house residents until it's safe to travel back on the streets. It's illegal right now to be outside on your own.
This was it. This was the horror she had been waiting for. This was the dystopian nightmare she had been trying to avoid all this time. "No!" Emily screamed, reaching out to grab Sophia by the forearm. She wasn't sure why she had done it. It had been reflexive, an in-the-moment action meant to strike out at the very concept of this martial law society. Sophia attempted to pull herself back, gasping in alarm. "Let go!" Sophia exclaimed in fear now. But Emily's grip on the girl's wrist was tight. Her panic constricted her fingers along the woman's joint with every squirming struggle that Sophia offered. "You need to let me out of here!" Emily screamed, her voice reaching its loudest and drawing the attention of the other people in the ICU, including the soldiers. She started to pull on Sophia, reaching out with her other hand. "Help!" Sophia called out, her gaze rising to meet that of the armed soldiers in the room. The medic lashed out in the only way available to her. She drove the open palm of her hand right into the bandages covering Emily's side. The simple pressure caused the young woman to cry out in pain and release her grip. Sophia jumped back, trying to create some distance, as suddenly 3 soldiers appeared over Emily. One of them was holding a syringe in his hand. He leaned down, ready to jab the needle into her flesh, but Emily was too fast for him. While keeping her torso steady, she reached out and grabbed the man by the wrist. Stopping him in his tracks, she struck out with the other arm, punching him squarely in the windpipe. He gasped for air and fell back, knocking a steel-wheeled tray table to the floor. It fell with a loud clatter as the other 2 soldiers moved in. Emily punched at the next closest one, coming in from her left where Sophia had just been a moment before. But she overestimated her reach and jostled her torso in the process. The sudden stab of pain caused her to miss the soldier completely and cry out. Her hand flew to her side as she felt several stitches pop. The 2 soldiers were on her instantly. They grabbed her by the arms and shoulders, not with the calm, gentle assurance demonstrated by Sophia earlier, but with the restrictive and dominating grip of an adversary. She tried to fight, but her every move caused further explosions of pain that nearly paralyzed her. All Emily could do was scream as the man she had punched rose to his feet. The syringe still clutched in his hand. She tried to fight, tried to push against them, but she was so weakened now. And every burst of pain sapped a little more of her strength. It was only a matter of time before they would triumph over her. As Emily screamed through her frustration, a tear squeezing itself out of the corner of her eye, she saw the needle in her arm and watched with horror as the soldier pushed down on the plunger. She instantly felt the numbing waves of whatever chemical tranquilizer was working its way through her system. Her brain began to feel fuzzy, and while she tried to fight against it, her effort only delayed the inevitable. Her eyelids heavy, Emily gave one last weakened scream, and her eyes sealed themselves shut once more. Her last thought as she drifted off into unconsciousness was of panic. "Dad, help me." Chapter 9. Captain Mike Thompson laid down in what was at one time an on-call room for doctors and nurses who were working overnight shifts. The transformation of this hospital into a military infirmary and base had taken more time than he'd anticipated. Of course, Mike had found himself in much worse accommodations over the years. Overseas, he slept in the dirt, in the sand, and in dank caves. It was true that having a roof over his head was a luxury, one he would have killed for many times throughout his long and prosperous military career. However, there was something about his current arrangement that made him long for the days of dirt, rocks, and caves. Back then, he had been abroad, overseas, fighting the good fight in far-off places that never truly felt like home. But now, everything was different. Now he was home, and he was still at war. When he and his unit had been assigned to the heart of Manhattan, he found it to be a strange deployment. Walking around the city on domestic soil in full combat gear while armed had unnerved him. But he assumed there had been a purpose behind it all, something he wasn't able to see because he didn't have the proper clearance. He trusted the system and assumed the officers and intelligence agents who guided military action only had the best intentions. It wasn't his job to question. It was his job to make decisions. He was a good soldier, and good soldiers followed orders. That was the mantra he continued to repeat to himself over and over again silently for the last several days. He and his military family, as he liked to consider his unit, had been in Manhattan for 2 weeks prior to the EMP detonation. When the worst had finally come to pass, Mike had been utterly shocked. However, his orders suddenly made complete sense. Someone, at some higher level, knew something was going to happen. But if that were the case, why hadn't they been actively trying to stop it? Why was their job simply to maintain order after the fact? Mike justified this in his head by assuming that someone else on some other team had been attempting to combat whatever malevolent forces sought to bring American society crashing down. That had been their job, and this was Mike's. Good soldiers follow orders. And so, Mike and his team had followed orders. After the EMP detonation, they reported back to base. They, along with hundreds of other soldiers, had gathered inside the massive Jacob Javits Center right in the harbor. It was a huge convention space that had become their central base of operations since the disaster had struck. The soldiers waited there for hours for someone to fill them in, to tell them what was going on. That was when everything went to hell. A series of rapid-fire explosions had erupted around the city, bringing down buildings and causing massive losses of life. Mike and his fellow soldiers had been ready to move out, ready to storm out of the convention center into the city to try to find whoever was behind the attack and put an end to them once and for all. But their orders had come through immediately. They were to stay put and allow the explosions to continue unabated. Those orders confused Mike, but he assumed that perhaps with their communications down, they were having a difficult time receiving concrete orders from command. Were they blind and deaf in this scenario? Were they supposed to be out there, but their limited communications kept them grounded? Mike had wanted to question his immediate superiors about this very thought, but he stopped himself. Good soldiers follow orders. Then, hours after explosion had lit up the night sky, they were finally given leave to make their way out into the city. The soldiers had been addressed by General Robert Mercer himself. He had been dubbed No Mercy Mercer by his troops over the years. The general was a stern and strict man. Built like a tank, with short-cropped silver hair and a thick face and jawline that looked as though it had been carved into the side of a mount. When he spoke, his deep, commanding voice resonated with the undeniable power of natural authority. The man had been a born leader. He stood at the far end of the conversation center's main hall, standing on a series of crates to make sure everyone could see him.
"I know the last few days have been harrowing for you all,"
the general had said. The statement hadn't rung with any kind of compassion or empathy. It was a matter-of-fact delivery with no emotional inflection.
"And I know you want answers. Believe me, we all do. Unfortunately, The nature of this attack has naturally put a limit on our ability to communicate with intelligence organizations in high command. We are currently working on a solution to that problem, but in the meantime, I'm going to be blunt with you all. We're flying blind. We have no idea who was behind this attack, nor do we understand their reasons. I don't know about y'all, but I don't much care to know their reasons. These people attacked American citizens on American soil. They've launched an attack that, as far as we know, is nationwide.
That had caught Mike completely off guard. This was nationwide? The entire country was without electrical power? How could that be? How could someone have launched an attack of such magnitude right under their noses?
Right now, there's nothing we can do to stop these explosions. We don't know what kind of bombs were used, and we don't know how many of them there are.
Mike was surprised at the frank nature of the general's speech. He had never heard any superior officer, let alone a general, admit that they had absolutely no idea what was going on. Mike had always been able to follow any order at any time because he assumed that the people issuing them were more informed than he was. But now, he was learning that, in this situation at least, no one knew what the heck was happening.
Due to the severity of this threat, we will be taking a more cautious approach,
the general said.
We will be deploying once we are certain that the immediate threat has abated. At that time, we will begin a search and rescue mission on multiple fronts. We will be searching for survivors first and foremost. But at the same time, we will also be trying to find any information we can about what happened and who is to blame. Because of this, I am declaring a state of martial law within Manhattan and the boroughs.
Had the room not been filled with decorated and experienced soldiers, there might have been gasps of surprise. But there had been none of that, not in the presence of No Mercy Mercer.
Since we do not yet know whether this threat is foreign or domestic, we will be detaining all citizens of New York City.
The general said this with an extreme finality, the kind of mic-dropping confidence that practically dared anyone to question him.
You will make it clear that we are not arresting anyone. They're simply being relocated for the duration of this disaster. During that time, we will launch our investigation and find out who's to blame for this horrifying tragedy. Dismissed.
The idea of detaining American citizens on American soil as though they were criminals made Mike's stomach turn. But the general's reasoning made a lot of sense. If they had no idea who or what was to blame for this epic event, how would they ever be able to stop another series of explosions from wiping out the city completely? While martial law was a frightening prospect, it seemed the most logical solution to the problem. And so, Mike and his unit had gone out into the city, combing through the streets filled with dead bodies, checking for survivors, and informing anyone and everyone they came across that they were required to report to military housing. Other units had been setting up camps throughout the city. There was a large, fenced-in area with tents and rations being set up in Central Park. Additionally, large buildings that were still standing had been repurposed. That included courthouses, libraries, and even hospitals, like the one in which Mike and his team were stationed. The hospitals were filled to the brim. Anyone who was injured was immediately brought to these medical facilities. It was the job of Mike and his team to assist in securing the location. Once the patients were well enough to travel, they would be relocated to one of the other housing communities. But for many of these people, that was going to take some time. The streets had been filled with burned and mangled bodies. Those who still clung to life were barely hanging on. Over the last 5 days, the hospital had lost more than half the patients who were brought through the door. Of course, many of the citizens of New York who were brought to these facilities were dragged in against their will. Mike had dealt with a lot of resistance this week. He and his team had been called fascists and likened to jackbooted thugs. Those words had pierced through Mike's body armor in a way that no bullet ever could. He was a believer in the American dream, a passionate soldier who held the core tenets of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness close to his heart. But good soldiers follow orders. Mike's orders had been very clear. It wasn't his place to question, it was his place to serve. He knew this well and wore his duty proudly, like a badge of honor. He understood the general's reasoning. He even agreed with it. So why then did he feel so rotten inside? Why had he avoided looking at himself in the mirror over the last few days? Why did the body armor beneath his fatigue suddenly feel so heavy? He sat up on the small cot in the on-call room, swinging his legs over the side and planting his booted feet on the linoleum floor. The captain sighed and laid his head in his hands. "Can't sleep, Cap?" A familiar voice cut through the darkness to address him. This was someone he knew just about as well as any member of his actual family. "I don't know if I want to meet the man who can get a good night's sleep during all of this, Raven," he said with a shrug. The voice of Lena Turner, known to her team members by the call sign Raven, cut through the darkness of the room much like the very cry of the bird she was named for. "Sometimes when you know too much," she said, "you have to find ways to compartmentalize, or you'll never sleep again." Mike knew she was speaking from experience. A former intelligence officer and skilled infiltrator, Lena's background in espionage and covert operations made her an invaluable asset to Mike's team. The black-haired and dark-eyed 27-year-old woman excelled in gathering critical information, cracking codes, and navigating dangerous territories undetected. Her call sign, Raven, came from her specially issued dark attire and an innate ability to move like a shadow. "Well, some of us are trying to sleep," an annoyed, accented voice called out from the other end of the room. Mike had to stifle a sad laugh at the sound of the irritated Australian accent booming through the darkened space. "Sorry about that, Spar," he said, reaching to scratch at the back of his neck. "Sod off with your fucking sorries," the gravelly, deep voice said, with an air of weariness about it that Mike understood all too well. The owner of that voice, Jackson Spartan Reynolds, was a former Special Forces soldier with expertise in advanced weapons and combat tactics. Sometimes called by the shortened titles of Jack or Spar, he was the team's heavy hitter. Renowned in the Australian Special Forces for marksmanship and physical prowess, he'd been assigned to the U.S. military and placed under Mike's command as part of a personnel transfer. His stoic demeanor and unwavering loyalty to his comrades had long ago earned him the nickname Spartan. A sudden burst of light filled the room as a lantern that hung from one of the bunks was lit. Even that dim light made Mike squint, and he peered through the flickering orange glow to see a thin, bald man with a caramel complexion and an angular face, grimacing as he sat up on the bunk atop the one Spartan complained from. "Spar, your ability to rouse even the deepest sleeper with those dulcet tones continues to impress," he said. "Up yours, whiz," Jackson growled, reaching up with one thick arm to punch at the base of the bed above him. Elijah Whisper Blackwood groaned as the big man's arm moved his entire bed. A former tracker and wilderness survival expert, Elijah's connection with nature had always allowed him to keep the team out of trouble whenever navigating dangerous terrain. A Native American of the Cherokee tribe, Elijah had grown up on a reservation where he was taught the skills needed to survive in even the harshest environments. His tracking prowess and knowledge of wildlife had provided invaluable support during reconnaissance and hunting missions the team had undertaken through the years. His silent and introverted nature had earned him the nickname Whisper. "I can't sleep either," Whisper stated, his voice giving off not one shred of emotion. "Something on your mind, soldier?" Mike asked him. He was met with a deepening silence. as though Whisper was weighing the pros and cons of being honest with his commanding officer. Despite their differences in rank, Mike maintained a healthy relationship with all of his teammates. They were the one family one another had out on missions like this. But he knew this particular assignment was weighing on them all in many ways.
Just can't wait to get back out to another day of dragging innocent people out of their homes.
Whisper replied dryly. Oh, here we go, Spartan sighed, sitting up in his bed now and planting his massive boots on the ground. He reached up to scratch at his scraggly bearded chin.
I'm not getting another bloody wink of sleep tonight, I can already tell.
Can it, soldier? Mike said, narrowing his eyes at Spartan. The giant had a good heart when it mattered most, but he could be a boorish and unsympathetic jackass at times. Spartan nodded at the command and stood, sighing as he walked to the other side of the room. He was still wearing his pants and boots, but his torso was completely bare. Spartan's muscles stretched as he stood, reaching his arms out to the side. Mike wondered sometimes if the big man flexed like that in front of them on purpose.
It just seems a little familiar, is all,
he said, and Mike quickly understood where the Native American tracker was coming from. Mike thought back to the history of Whisper's people, to the atrocities committed upon them through the centuries when the American government decided it needed their land and resources. Mike couldn't pretend to understand what that must have felt like. To be forcibly relocated only because someone somewhere in some other part of the world that you might never see made a decision that directly impacted your life. His heart went out to Whisper at that moment. Mike hadn't thought about the historical significance of their actions. He simply understood they had orders that needed to be followed. It was hard to imagine that the government he served so faithfully could ever be looked at as the bad guy in any situation. However, sometimes it paid to have another perspective. Growing up as Mike had, in a very Caucasian suburb, it was often easy to overlook the plight of those who faced oppression, based solely on their nationality. He wanted to reassure his friend, and at that moment, he wanted to redirect his mental narrative. Unfortunately, Mike was having a difficult time figuring out just where that narrative would have gone. What could he have possibly said to justify the orders they had been given? Was there anything he could offer up that might make the group as a whole feel better about their actions over the last several days? Nothing sprang to mind immediately. Try as he might to turn the situation over in his head, looking at it from all potential angles, he wasn't able to find the right words. Mike wasn't sure the right words existed in this case. He opened his mouth to respond, and closed it once more with a sigh. He could only think of one thing to say that might put things into perspective.
Good soldiers follow orders,
he stated blankly, with none of the emotion he might have normally backed that statement up with.
I guess they do,
Whisper replied with a shrug of his shoulders, lying back down on his bed.
You all right, Cap?
Raven asked from the bunk above his. Mike looked over to his right to see her head appear over its edge, her ebony hair spilling down, wafting near his face so close that he could blow it out of his way.
I'm fine,
Mike said, trying to convey strength in front of his team. While they all considered one another friends, and even family, he was still their leader, and still felt like it was important to show strength at all times.
I don't know about that,
Raven said. Of all the team, she had been with Mike the longest and knew the peaks and valleys of his mood the best.
Oh, for God's sake, woman,
Spartan said with a scoff.
Let the bloody man be, will ya? He said he's fine, so he's fine.
Right, Raven said with a roll of her eyes that could be seen through the hair that fell down around her head.
That's an astute observation, coming from the king of mental health over there. Hey, I'm the most well-adjusted member of this team,
Spartan retorted, at which all three of his team members in the room let out a hearty laugh.
Oh, screw all of you,
the massive Aussie said with a dismissive wave of one burly arm. Before anyone could retort or Raven could ask her question again, the entire team was cut off by the door to their bunk opening slowly. A petite Asian woman walked inside, holding one of her wrists and rotating it painfully. Spartan had been the first to notice the grimace of pain on her face and instantly crossed the room in 2 massive strides, holding his arms out to examine the limb.
What happened, medic?
He asked before anyone else. Mike was already rising from his bed as well to cross over to the final member of his team. Sophia Medic Chen was a skilled combat medic and field surgeon. Her medical training and knowledge of herbal remedies had always made her vital in providing critical medical care to the team during missions. She also served as a lookout, keeping an eye for any potential dangers and threats that might impact the rest of the team. She was a quiet and compassionate soul, one who would never hurt anyone or anything without cause. While that didn't give her the killer edge that a soldier often needed on the battlefield, it did make her a pretty wonderful medic and a friend to every other member of the team.
Remember the girl with the survival pack?
Sophia asked, gesturing with her head back toward the door, and Mike instantly knew exactly who she was talking about. As the team wound its way through the city, they had come in contact with many corpses and injured survivors. But one survivor had stood out to Mike more than any other. She was a young blonde woman, hair tied back in a tight ponytail. She was stabbed in the stomach by a piece of shrapnel from one of the explosions, but had still stubbornly clung to life when the team found her. Mike had been amazed, as it had to have been several hours since the initial injury. She had lost a lot of blood, though, and he didn't have much hope that she would survive. But what truly caught Mike's attention was the pistol holstered at her side and the large bag on her back. As Sophia worked diligently to provide first aid and close the wound, Mike had inspected the bag. Inside, he saw just about everything one might expect to find on a survivalist, from lightweight rations and water to weapons, tools, and light sources. This woman had been prepared for this exact moment. Seeing what was clearly a well-thought-out bug-out bag reminded Mike of his grandfather. The old man had been doomsday prepping for decades, and he taught Mike exactly how one should deal with events that changed the course of society. Mike had taken these lessons to heart, but never wanted to accept the grim future that his grandfather had painted for him. The old man had believed that the end of the world was an inevitability. Mike, however, perhaps naively, believed that with enough work and determination, humanity could improve itself and avoid such a fate. One of the main reasons he had become a soldier in the first place was to help make a difference and stop threats that might lead to a global catastrophe. He wondered if the old man was looking down on him now from heaven, shaking his head at his grandson's lack of preparation. Instead of preparing for this moment, he had been actively working to avoid it. Yet, despite all of his work, despite all of his faith in the human race, the end times had so come to pass.
Yeah,
Mike said with a nod.
How could I forget? Did she finally pass?
Sophia shook her head emphatically.
No,
she said with a deep exhale.
She woke up.
Mike's eyebrows shot up, and he noted the other members of his team suddenly straightening up and leaning in, eagerly anticipating Sophia's story. Even Spartan, who was still standing in front of the petite woman, seemed interested in a way he couldn't hide.
What the hell happened?
Spartan asked, the edge of suspicion pushing on his tone. Mike noticed he was looking from Sophia's bruised wrist, back up into her face, over and over again. He was clearly coming to the same conclusion that Mike was.
She freaked out,
Sophia replied bluntly.
When I explained to her what had happened, she started to get belligerent, even violent.
She held up her wrist as evidence of what she'd been through.
Holy crap,
Raven said, and Mike watched as the woman's bare legs swung over the side of the bunk and jumped down to the floor. Raven straightened to her full height and rushed across the room to take a look at Sophia's wrist.
What happened? What did she do?
Sophia's mouth pressed into a thin, straight line. She shook her head and closed her eyes, as though she were at war with herself inside.
When she heard about the martial law declaration, she freaked out.
Sophia said with a long, deep sigh.
She grabbed me. I'm not proud of it, but I had to jab her in the stitches to get away. Then some of the soldiers came to try to subdue her. She took one of them out from the bed.
Damn, Spartan said, shaking his head in disbelief. Mike's eyebrows rose.
When you say, took them out,
he said, letting his voice trail off.
No, she didn't kill them,
Sophia said.
But I have a feeling if she was healthy and didn't have a hole in her side, she could have easily. She grabbed him by the wrist and punched him in the throat. But they eventually got her down and tranquilized her. You should have seen her reaction when she heard she wasn't free to leave.
Interesting, Raven said thoughtfully.
So clearly she's got some training,
Spartan added, while Whisper remained quietly seated on his bunk.
A highly trained and armed civilian who panics at the thought of being detained by the government. Well, I think we've got our first lead as to who's behind this attack. They're definitely gonna find out who she's working for.
I'm sure the brass is going to think so,
Sophia said.
But I don't know. I didn't get that vibe from her.
She could just be afraid,
Mike offered, remembering how his grandfather used to talk about the power of government and how things could very quickly spiral out of control.
Yeah, I'm sure the general isn't gonna see it that way,
Spartan said with a scoff, passing back over to his bunk.
Guys,
Sophia said, her voice trailing off as she looked up into the air, searching for the right words.
Protecting a powerless city,
Spartan offered.
Without us here, these people would turn into animals and start ripping each other to pieces.
So you're saying they're a bunch of savages? Whisper asked, and Spartan immediately backed down.
That ain't what I'm saying, and you know it,
he hissed back up at the other man.
That's the excuse the government used to steamroll through my people. Or at least one of the many excuses.
All right, enough, Mike said, walking toward the two men as though he were afraid one of them might attack the other. His team had always been very close, and disagreements between them outside of sporting teams and the occasional debate about a comic book character were practically non-existent. However, this was maybe the fourth such argument or moment of dissension among them this week alone.
Yes, sir,
Spartan said, turning his back and walking to the other side of the room to cool off. Mike looked at Whisper, waiting for a vocal confirmation that the subject had been dropped. However, Whisper simply laid back down on his bed and turned his back.
Sophia, you need to get some rest,
Raven said, cutting through the tension within the room and trying to lead their friend and colleague over toward a free bed.
I'm fine,
Sophia said.
Besides, I'm still on duty for another 3 hours.
Well then, what are you doing back here?
They sent me back here to get the captain,
Sophia said, turning toward Mike.
What for?
Mike asked, an eyebrow raised in question.
The general is here,
Sophia said.
He's gathering all the officers in one of the lecture halls for medical students. Hall B, they said.
Mike nodded and took a step forward, laying a strong hand on Sophia's shoulder.
Thanks,
he said.
Make sure you take care of yourself. Maybe get some ice on that wrist.
I will,
she said.
It's really not that bad, just a little sore. We've all had worse.
Mike nodded in agreement, turning to look at each of his team members one at a time. They had been through so much together, from Iraq to Afghanistan and several other places in between. However, this mission had been testing them like no other before. It wasn't cut and dry. It couldn't be justified away like so many of their other operations had been. Good soldiers follow orders. Mike told himself that one last time as he turned to walk from the room. He had a feeling that the general had a few more orders for him to follow in this meeting, And he knew deep down he wasn't going to like them.